In the final moments of descent toward Chuck, a Boeing 737 flies straight into a thunderstorm cell. Rain hits the windshield and the plane pitches up slightly, climbing above the glide path. Hoping to get back on the slope, the captain pushes the nose of the plane down, sending the jet toward the open waters of the Pacific Ocean. The descent continues and visibility drops quickly as the runway ahead begins to vanish into thick cloud. Manually flying the aircraft, the crew struggles to stay oriented without visual references and in heavy rain. Their control inputs push the plane into a dangerously steep descent as terrain warnings echo through the flight deck. How did a routine landing turn into a life-or-death situation? And will the crew realize what's happening before it's too late? This is the story of Air New Guinea Flight 73. In the early morning hours of September 28, 2018, a Boeing 737 departed Pohnpei International Airport, located on one of the 600 islands that comprise the Federated States of Micronesia in the South Pacific. The aircraft operating Flight 73 for Papua New Guinea's national air carrier was bound for Chuck, where it would make an intermediate stop before continuing the larger journey between Pohnpei and Port Moresby. Introduced only 2 years earlier, the new route was the result of an agreement between Papua New Guinea and the Federated States of Micronesia to strengthen the relationship between the nations and boost tourism. The aircraft was carrying 12 crew members and 35 passengers. Due to the small population of the Federated States of Micronesia, flying nearly empty between Pohnpei and Chuck was not uncommon for Air New Guinea. It was not a profitable route. Hence, the airline received subsidies from the Federated States of Micronesia as an incentive to continue operating within the country. Carrying 30,000 pounds of fuel, the aircraft had sufficient fuel for the journey to Port Moresby without refueling in Chuck. The 52-year-old captain in charge of Flight 73, who was also the pilot flying on this leg, was a national of Papua New Guinea with just under 20,000 hours of total flying time. He had spent 1/4 of his flying time as a captain, including 2,500 hours as a pilot in command on the Boeing 737. The first officer, a 35-year-old Australian national, had a total of 4,600 hours of flight time. He was relatively new to the 737 with only 370 flight hours on the aircraft type. As pilot flying, the captain was at the aircraft's controls on the flight to Chuck. The first officer, who was the pilot monitoring, was tasked with handling all radio communications and maintaining a general watch of the aircraft, which included calling out any deviations from the standard operating procedures. The specific airframe assigned to Flight 73 was a 2005 Boeing 737-800, one of the 3 737NG models operated by Air New Guinea. Before joining the Air New Guinea fleet, it was flown by Air India Express and Jet Airways. It was officially owned by an Iceland-based company and leased to Air New Guinea. As part of their leasing agreement, the LEO required one of its aircraft maintenance engineers to accompany the aircraft on all flights outside of Papua New Guinea. On Flight 73, the engineer sat behind the flight crew in one of the aircraft's jump seats. Out of personal interest, he was recording this flight using his cell phone. In aviation, timing is everything. Seconds matter, and reacting fast can make all the difference. And when it comes to building your online presence, speed matters, too. With ODO, the sponsor of today's video, getting your website live is quick and easy. In just 4 quick steps, you go from idea to launch. Choose your site type, industry, pick a color palette, or upload your logo. Add the features you need and choose a theme. From there, ODU's built-in AI generates the structure of your site in seconds. All you then need to do is drag, drop, and customize. No coding, no time wasted on clunky interfaces, just a fast, clear path from idea to reality. But ODU is more than just a website builder. It's a complete business management platform with integrated apps for everything from accounting and inventory to CRM, project tracking, email marketing, and more. Everything works together in one place, so you don't waste time switching tools or syncing data. And yes, it's free to get started. Your first app is free for life with unlimited hosting support and even a free custom domain name for the first year. So whether you're starting from scratch or scaling fast, ODU helps you move quickly without cutting corners. Try the website app for free today and build your site faster than you ever thought possible. This aircraft was unique to the fleet because it was the only 737 equipped with an integrated augmented navigation system. The system's main purpose was to provide a visual aid in the shape of two magenta diamonds that show deviations by sliding up or down and to either side. Without the system, these diamonds would not appear on an RNAV approach, the type of approach flown by the crew of Flight 73, which we will discuss later in this video. Because it was the only aircraft in the fleet with ANS, the airline never intended to use the system. Despite the planned removal of the system from the aircraft, the procedure was never carried out. As a result, the system was still operational, but the pilots were never trained to use it. An important mishap that played a role in the outcome of flight at 380 miles, the leg to Chuck was not going to take much more than an hour in total flight time. Considering the time required to climb to and descend from a relatively high altitude of 40,000 foot chosen for this short flight, the crew only spent a few minutes in cruise before they started the preparations for the approach. To get the most accurate performance numbers for their approach, the first officer used an application called Operation Performance Tool, which was installed on his electronic flight bag provided by the airline. By inputting current weather conditions and estimated landing weight, he calculated approach speeds for different flap settings and the minimum runway length required to stop the aircraft. At the time of Flight 73, Air New Guinea was still in the process of acquiring permission from the government authorities to use the software for performance calculations, and it was only provided to pilots for training purposes. Until then, all calculations had to be completed using paper-based charts and tables which were carried on board. Using the software tool instead of the paper charts still provided very accurate landing performance numbers for Flight 73 and thus did not severely affect its outcome. However, the crew's decision to use unapproved software reflected a broader pattern of complacency and an overly casual atmosphere in the flight deck. A worrying sign. 73. Using the landing data from the OPT, both pilots agreed to set the flaps at 40 degrees for the approach, as it would reduce their landing distance by approximately 500 feet, although it may seem that 500 feet does not make a big difference for a fast turbine-powered aircraft. We should remember that most airports in the Pacific are located on atolls and small islands where land availability is limited. The runway at Chuck Airport was only 6,000 feet long, while the landing distance required for a Boeing 737-800 can vary between 3,500 feet and 5,000 feet depending on its weight. Furthermore, the runway at Chuck Airport was not equipped with a runway end safety area, a surface surrounding the runway intended to help slow down an aircraft in case it travels beyond runway limits. Combined, these factors implied that the landing would have to be as precise as possible, and reducing stopping distance was an important consideration for pilots operating into these smaller airports. Continuing their preparations for the arrival, the crew discussed the RNAV Runway 04 approach procedure for Chuck Airport. Arriving from the east, Flight 73 would fly over the McNo waypoint toward Cavalry. After Cavalry, it would turn to Figby, crossing it at 2,500 feet and then turn onto the final approach course for Runway 04, overflying Fasbo, the final approach fix, at an altitude of 1,700 feet. The last waypoint before the runway was the missed approach point, HMAX, with the lowest crossing altitude of 420 feet, also known as the minimum descent altitude. A missed approach point is the make or break point in every instrument approach. To continue beyond it, the crew must have a clear view of the runway while maintaining the stabilized approach criteria. In all other cases, a go-around following the published missed approach procedure is an absolute necessity. Descending any further or deviating off track without having visual contact with the runway puts the aircraft and everyone on board in grave danger. Something the crew of Flight 73 would learn the hard way. Because the vertical glide path for this RNAV approach was not officially indicated in the approach procedure, it was calculated by the aircraft's flight management system. As a result, the pilots could not rely on the autopilot for the final stages of the flight and would have to manually fly the aircraft past the missed approach point, increasing pilot workload and leaving more room for dangerous deviations from the intended flight path. Discussing the missed approach procedure, the captain briefly mentioned flying to the Demay waypoint without going into detail regarding the path to be flown. His briefing did not include all the items required by the company's standard operating procedures, suggesting that he may have committed to landing the aircraft early in the approach and dismissed the possibility of a go-around. By applying a more laid-back approach to flying the plane and skipping the required steps, the crew of Flight 73 was putting the safety of everyone on board at risk. Approximately 35 minutes after departing Pompeii, Flight 73 began the descent from cruise altitude and requested an update on the weather at the airport from ATC. The controller informed the crew that the winds were relatively calm at only 5 knots. The visibility was 14 miles, and there were scattered cumulonimbus clouds at 1,200 feet above the ground, with a layer of broken clouds much higher at 12,000 feet. Cumulonimbus clouds form when warm, moist air rises into the atmosphere and condenses as it begins to cool. These clouds are very common in tropical and equatorial regions, particularly around the Pacific Islands. As they expand and grow vertically, these clouds frequently develop into severe thunderstorms, producing heavy rain, hail, and strong turbulence. For this reason, pilots try to avoid flying in and around cumulus clouds. As the aircraft continued its descent, the first officer made position reports to ATC and, passing through 8,000 feet, switched to the local frequency at Chuck Airport to broadcast the aircraft's intentions. Because of the low volume of air traffic in the area, there is no control tower at Chuck, and pilots must monitor the common traffic frequency themselves and coordinate directly to avoid collisions. In the cabin, the flight attendants made their final walkthrough, verifying that all passengers were seated and ready for the approach. As the rest of the descent progressed without issue, no one on board suspected trouble ahead. Getting closer to the Figby waypoint and passing through 4,000 feet, the captain began briefing the missed approach. He stopped halfway through and did not finish his sentence. Neither did the first officer reply or inquire about the reason for the interruption. The go-around procedure thus remained omitted from the crew briefing. At 9:20 a.m. local time, 1 hour after leaving Pompeii, Flight 73 was nearing the end of its journey. The aircraft continued its descent toward the airport, passing through 2,300 feet and turned to a heading of 041 degree for the final approach course to runway 04 at Chuck. The captain verbally confirmed that the aircraft was on the RNAV approach and correctly aligned with the runway. He then told the first officer that he would continue the descent to 1,000 feet along the approach path. The first officer made another call on the traffic frequency, broadcasting this information. After lowering the aircraft's landing gear and setting the flaps to the 15 degrees position, the first officer informed the captain that there were some rain showers near the airport. It was the first sign that Flight 73 was approaching the cumulonimbus clouds, as reported by ATC earlier in the flight. The aircraft's weather radar painted multiple red patches on the navigation display, a clear warning of strong thunderstorm cells ahead. Acknowledging the first officer's concerns, the captain stated that the storm would be out soon. Continuing the approach, the captain told the first officer that he would just go down on the poppies. The Precision Approach Path Indicator, or PAPI, is a system consisting of 4 lights installed beside the runway and usually just past the threshold. The system guides pilots toward the runway touchdown zone in the final stages of the approach. Each of the 4 poppy lights is angled to only appear either red or white depending on the pilot's vertical position in relation to the glide path. A pilot flying on the correct glide path will see 2 white and 2 red lights next to each other. Seeing 4 whites means the aircraft is too high, while 4 reds indicate the aircraft is well below the glide path. Back in the flight deck, the captain called for flaps to be set to the 40 degrees position and requested the first officer to complete the landing checks. A computerized 1000 call-out inside the flight deck informed the crew that they had approached the altitude of 1,000 feet above the ground. In accordance with the company procedures, the first officer verified that the aircraft was on the proper glide path for the runway and at its calculated approach speed, meeting the stabilized approach criteria defined by the airline. Descending another 100 feet, the crew broke out of the clouds and saw the runway ahead of them. The aircraft was configured, everything looked normal, and the pilots were ready to land. A minute later, approaching 600 feet, the captain noticed that the aircraft was slightly above the glide path. As they were nearing the missed approach point, he disconnected the autopilot and pushed the aircraft's nose slightly down to get back on the correct descent angle. Moments later, streaks of rainwater covered the entire windshield. They had flown into a thunderstorm cell, the red area depicted on their navigation displays. Determined to get back on the slope and land, the captain asked the first officer to turn on the windshield wipers and continued to fly through the rain. Looking outside the aircraft, The first officer told the captain that he saw 3 white and 1 red poppy lights, indicating that the aircraft was above the glide path and further convincing the captain that he needed to dive for the runway. As the aircraft passed the minimum descent altitude accompanied by the minimum's audio alert, the runway began to disappear in the cloud, a situation that would warrant a go-around maneuver. Continuing below the minimum descent altitude without visual contact with the runway was not just against company policies. It posed grave danger to everyone on board the aircraft as the pilots were no longer able to judge their height from the ground. Despite entering the instrument meteorological conditions, the crew of Flight 73 chose to continue the approach, focusing only on chasing the glide path and landing in Chuck. The aircraft's descent angle steepened from 3 degrees to 4.5 degrees. It would get the 737 back on the slope, but the consequences of this decision could be deadly. Sensing a dangerous rate of descent, the enhanced ground proximity warning system issued a sync rate audio alert inside the flight deck. This system, designed to monitor the aircraft's descent rate, issues an audio alert anytime the vertical speed exceeds 1,000 feet per minute if the aircraft is below 2,500 feet above the ground. It is treated as a warning message and is not to be taken lightly, which is why pilots are instructed to execute a go-around maneuver at any time such an alert is heard on an approach. Despite the company policy, the captain acknowledged the alert and told the first officer that he just wanted to get back on the approach profile. At only 500 feet above the ground, the aircraft continued to descend, losing another 25 feet of altitude with every second. Moments later, a glide slope warning cut through the flight deck, adding to the chaos. Remember the magenta diamonds we discussed earlier? As the aircraft continued descending, the vertical diamond slid almost all the way to the top, indicating that the aircraft was well below the intended glide path. Triggered by this major deviation, the system was attempting to warn the pilots. However, due to the lack of proper training and continuous exposure to these nuisance alerts, the pilots had become conditioned to ignoring the glide slope messages. As a last attempt to inform the crew of the dire situation, a red pull-up message appeared at the bottom of each pilot's primary flight display, prompting them to arrest the excessive descent and climb away from the water underneath. Despite the bright red warning and a mix of alerts, the captain maintained the descent rate, telling the first officer that he wanted to go a little bit more. How could an experienced captain ignore all safety warnings and continue his dangerous approach after losing sight of the runway? Against all odds, the captain of Air New Guinea Flight 73 succumbed to a human factors phenomenon known as fixation or tunneling. Chasing the goal of landing the aircraft, he had mentally committed to it and became laser-focused on continuing the approach, ignoring external factors that indicated the need to conduct a go-around. Realizing that they were only 100 feet above the ground and with several terrain warnings screaming over each other inside the flight deck, the first officer became understandably nervous about the condition of the aircraft and abruptly asked the captain if he saw the runway. Although the captain responded that he got it, the first officer still saw nothing but a thick white cloud ahead of him. Seconds later, terror struck him as the turquoise-colored water began to rapidly appear below the aircraft's nose. "Too low! We're too low!" he screamed repeatedly, but it was too late. Flight 73 struck the surface of the Pacific Ocean less than a mile from Chuck Airport. After hitting the water multiple times, the aircraft finally slowed down, turned nearly 180 degrees, and came to rest within 500 feet of the runway threshold. Government and privately owned boats and U.S. Navy divers stationed on the island rushed to the aircraft in hopes of finding survivors. After a short rescue operation, the crew accounted for all but one passenger. He was discovered inside the plane following a 3-day underwater search. It was later determined that the passenger had not been wearing a seat belt at the time of the impact and had sustained serious injuries that prevented him from evacuating the aircraft before it was too late. The story of Flight 73 is a stark reminder that despite advancements in technology, human decision-making remains the central element in safe aircraft operations. Determined to land at all costs, the flight crew ignored multiple warnings, sending a perfectly functional aircraft into the water. The investigation revealed no hazardous weather along the published missed approach route. Had the pilots initiated a go-around at the missed approach point, they would have avoided the thunderstorm cell that contributed to the fatal accident. The increase in the rate of descent in the final seconds of the flight shows the extent to which the captain became focused on catching the glide path and continuing with the landing despite losing visual contact with the runway. In his post-accident interview, the first officer admitted that despite having weather radar information right in front of them, the rain caught both pilots by surprise, confirming the investigators' suspicion that the flight crew had lost situational awareness while fixating on the landing only. A curious viewer may ask, why didn't the flight crew respond to all the terrain warnings that continued to go off inside the flight deck for nearly a minute? Reviewing the data from one day prior to the accident flight, the investigation board identified that this same flight crew flew the entire approach into Pohnpei Airport slightly below the glide path, ignoring 28 glide slope warnings from the aircraft. Although this normalization of deviance was not officially determined as a contributing factor in the report, we can assume that it could have played a certain part in the fate of Air New Guinea Flight 73. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more free tutorials.